welcome to the Trap House Podcast. Thanks for joining us. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe on all social media platforms. And now a quick word about our sponsors. We have Duke Traps with us. Check out duketraps.com. They manufacture over 40 different models of cage traps, coil and long springs, and body gripping style traps, as well as one of my personal favorites, the powder-coated dog proofs. Check out duketraps.com. Need a place to sell your fur? Check out Groenwald Fur and Wool Company. Over 50 years in the fur business, the largest and most experienced direct receiver of wild fur in the world. Check out their website, gfwco.com. Top Lot Stretcher Company. They have all the fur processing tools you need to get the job done in the fur shed. From push pins to wooden stretchers, they got you covered. Check out toplotstretcherco.com. And this one's for the ladies that don't mind getting their hands a little dirty setting some traps. We have Trapping Girl Inc. with us. Check out their website, trappinggirlinc.com. They have a great selection of women's apparel, kids apparel, baits and lures, and trapping supplies. Check out trappinggirlinc.com. J3 Outdoors. They make American trapping products designed for maximum trapline efficiency with products like the Hags Bracket and Spring Clip, as well as the Universal Lock and Beaver Rod ends. Get the tools you need to get the job done. Find out more at j3o.com. And there's only one true way to start out the day on the trap line, and that's with a hot cup of coffee from Trapline Coffee. They have great tasting blends to choose from, as well as chocolates. Head over to traplinecoffee.com for more. Weeby Knives. Check out weebyknives.com. They have a great selection of skinning knives, fleshing knives, fur handling tools, and they'll give you the edge you need to get the job done, and you guessed it, they're wicked sharp. Check out weebyknives.com. And we'd like to welcome the newest sponsor to the team, No BS Lures. Don't let the name fool you. There's more than just bait and lure. This company offers trapline tools and hardware, fur handling supplies, and the No BS traps. Check out nobslures.com. And last but not least, Hoosier Trapper Supply, home of the Top Dog Predator Bait, Jet Fuel Predator Lure. We offer a complete line of trapping baits and lures, deer scent, trapline tools and hardware, fur processing tools, and special package offers. Head over to HoosierTrapperSupply.com. All right, everyone, welcome back to the Trap House Podcast. We got 3 guests today with us. Jerry Ann is our Indiana fur bearer biologist is with us. Then we have Tim and Dawn with us as well. And I don't know your appropriate title. I'm sure you got a list underneath you, but we were all together on this podcast in 2020 talking about a gray fox project and study. We're going to kind of recap what we talked about and then where we are now with that study. So if you guys could just kind of briefly introduce yourself so the listeners know what's going on.
Yeah, so I can go first. I'm Jerry Ann Albers. I'm the Fur Bear and Turkey Program Leader for the Indiana DNR.
Okay.
And I'm Dawn Redding. I'm a professor of biology at Luther College, which is in Northeast Iowa.
And I am Tim Hiller, Executive Director of Wildlife Ecology Institute in Helena, Montana.
So we were spread out over the country. Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in at least 3 different time zones, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it always makes meetings interesting. We have to be clear on which time zone we're referring to when we pick meeting times.
Exactly. So
And
4:30.
And I've goofed it up like twice, I think. So
yeah. So you're 3:30, Tim, and Dawn, you're 4:30. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And then we're 5:30 here.
Because we're recording at 5:30,
Yeah.
Eastern.
If one of you could bring us up to speed on what we talked about last time. First of all, I think this is very interesting. Everyone wants to know, everyone asks questions about where are the gray fox, where are they going? So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say today on kind of where we are with what you've found.
Let's start out kind of at the beginning then and just bring everybody up to a start, where we were at 4 years ago.
Yeah, so I guess I can start because I initiated the project, right? So we had some questions about our gray foxes. And actually 2 of my predecessors in Indiana had tried to propose gray fox research and weren't able to get it going. But some of our, trappers weren't starting to see them as much. as they used to, and even our fur buyer records that we get annually, like harvest of gray foxes used to be over 12, 15,000 back in the 70s, and it dropped off pretty precipitously in like the 80s. And so we were trying to figure out, like the question I had initially out of the gate was, are we just at a new normal? Because, back in the 70s, we didn't really have bobcats, we didn't really have river otter, we didn't have very high coyote populations, our raccoons were much lower. Like, aren't we just at a new kind of normal where gray foxes are fine, but they're just not where they used to be when we really only had grays and reds and a few raccoons and possums? Or is there something wrong and we need to be worried about it? So we started collaborating with Wildlife Ecology Institute, Tim and Dawn at Luther College to start up a big research project. And we had a bunch of questions in the research project. I was pretty fortunate that state gave me a good chunk of our federal money that we could put toward trying to understand our gray foxes better. So we did 3 years of data collection, and then we've been doing about a little over a year and a half of data analysis, kind of looking at all the information we got from this project. But that was kind of the impetus for it, of trying to, what's going on with our gray foxes currently? Where are they? Do we see anything that's concerning? And kind of look for those red flags and kind of check in on the species that's important to Indiana. There are native fox. They're important to the fur community, to trappers and hunters and things like that. So just wanted to check in on them, make sure they were doing okay.
And I'll add the sort of patterns. So I'm here in Iowa, and there were, people having similar kind of concerns in other states too, sort of throughout the Midwest. So Indiana and spearheaded by Jerry Ann was kind of one of the first out of the gates to start a project, but there's also a number of states throughout the Midwest that are experiencing or seeing similar patterns and also starting to investigate.
And we had conversations with, other Midwestern states. Iowa's my home state, like what Don was mentioning, Illinois, Ohio. Those were, I may be missing one, but those were kind of the 4 states where we were really initiated some discussions, and probably Jerry Ann before, I was involved, or perhaps, but, and since, all of those have to varying degrees started to ramp up some gray fox research too since then. So that'll be adding to our knowledge base for sure. And we've been comparing notes and so on and so forth with them.
Yeah, there's several
But Tim,
states
you kind of headed up the project once Jerry Ann got the funding. Is that how that went?
Yeah, well, yeah. So we were the lead on that, and Dawn was gracious enough to lend her expertise and come on as a co-PI in our our group of 3, and for phase 2 now she's the lead, and I'm a co-PI on that along with Jerry Ann as well. So we've kind of swapped places in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
PI being principal investigator, which is our language
yes.
we
Sorry.
use around research. Like who's gonna do the most of the paperwork? I get to be PI, principal investigator.
So it has a cool name, but maybe not the coolest. Go through all the paper.
Yeah, it's not always the glamorous parts being the PI.
Yeah.
So
That's crazy.
So so there's a number of states that have ongoing projects. And so where are you guys at on the data that you collected from Indiana? And can you say that with finality at this point, or is that, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but are you waiting to hear from other states as well?
So we're wrapping up our analysis from the data we collected. We are hoping in the future we can kind of do, it's what we call a meta-analysis, where you take several different projects and you kind of analyze them all together. Because Missouri's done some work, Illinois is wrapping up some gray fox research, Ohio's kind of midway through their gray fox research, Iowa's been trying to do a little bit. Even other states like Maryland is trying to get some gray fox research off the ground. So it's not necessarily just the Midwest. There's a few other states as well, especially in the East. But yeah, we're analyzing our data in kind of a vacuum of Indiana initially, and then we're kind of hoping down the road we can collaborate with all these different states, kind of analyze all of our data and see if we're seeing the same themes across multiple states, and if that gives us better regional insight.
And the multi-state analysis, meta-analysis that Jerry Ann's mentioning, it's probably several years down, because really they might be, 2 years or less than a year into it, depending on the state. So,
And I think some states are finding it's challenging to study gray foxes. It's hard to get decent sized numbers. And so when you're looking for broad scale patterns, when you've got a sample size of, 12 animals or two animals in the
Right.
case of Iowa, or, depending on the state and how abundant they are, how rare they have become, it can be challenging, and it takes years to kind of build up a big enough data set that you can analyze and say something about what's
Mhm.
going on.
So in Indiana, did you guys, I'm assuming you kind of had to, that was a struggle too, was to get animals to collar and release or samples or uh, from road kills to guys that caught them in traps that killed them without knowing or whatever. But
yeah, and thank goodness for trappers. They really were a critical part of our success because, we started off, um, common knowledge tells us that you could cage trap gray foxes without a huge problem. And I've done it with red foxes, which are exceedingly difficult. For the life of us, we couldn't get a gray fox in a cage trap. And so we relied and we kept trying, and we used collarums as well for those that are familiar with that, and had some success later on. But we had an incentive program and we put the word out, thanks to folks like you, Indiana State Trappers Association, and others, really tried to put the word out. And we had a hotline phone number set up so that trappers could call us within our two study sites, one in central Indiana and one in southern, and say, hey, I've got a gray fox alive in a trap. And we would drop everything, or at least our field technicians would drop everything, get there, and in almost all cases, I think they were able to get it collared and released and stuff. So that just really, I can't mention how grateful we are for trapper participation within this.
mhm.
Yeah, they were a big part of our success. Without trappers calling us to collar foxes, our sample size would have been quite low.
Yeah.
It would have probably been, yeah, three. I think it would have been three. And in reality, it was what, 32 we got collared?
Pretty
And I
good.
think we could use
Tw-
26 of them were able to be used for some of our data analysis.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Of the, what, six that, did they just die fairly soon afterwards, or you lost track of them, or?
It's kind of a combination of either the collar failed or the fox died pretty quickly and things like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Which isn't unusual on a collaring project. There's usually several animals that you're not able to use for various reasons.
But then how many animals did you take, like from dead carcasses, just from dead animals?
What's our total there? 85,
I
Don?
think, yeah, I was gonna say 86, 88, somewhere in there. I can't remember, but yeah, kind of upper 80s.
Okay. And that was
So it's really good.
throughout the year, or, I mean, in terms of just road kills or whatever happened to show up, or
Yeah, I
primarily?
mean, it was a little bit scattered throughout the year, but it was still primarily, I would say, November through February is
Okay.
probably when most of those carcasses were, because it was maybe things that were, it could have been roadkill, but might have also been our project foxes that died, so mortality of one of our collared foxes. But then also foxes that were legally harvested, and then the hunter trapper provided us with the carcass.
So that was pushing like 120 animals, right? Is that correct?
If
There's
you
some
combine the two, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
there's some
if
overlap between the carcasses and the live captures, because some of our live captures died and so then
Okay. Okay.
they
end up in the
became a
carcass.
carcass.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So I guess as a layperson, I'm surprised that you guys were able to put up that many. I realize it went on for 3 seasons, but still, I'm surprised. I'm assuming you had to be pleased with that.
Yeah, I think we were hoping for 40 and we got pretty close. So, like, I thought it was pretty
Yeah.
good, especially with some other states that are, I think Illinois managed to get like 13 or 15, something like that. So, I think we did pretty well. One of the limitations, though, is our gray foxes really just don't seem to be super abundant in the northern part of the state.
Right.
So most of our collaring, as Tim said, had two focus areas, and the southern part is where most of them came out of, right?
Mhm.
Even our central study area, we did not get many carcasses out of, and collared animals out of, and we got a few from northern Indiana, but not a ton. But our stronghold seems to be, if you're from Indiana, Perry, Crawford, Harrison counties, which are kind of a cluster of counties down on the Ohio River.
Right.
And that's where most of our foxes came out of.
Yeah, it's some kind of a trend that I've noticed over the years. Oh, you've been there, Jerry, and at our fur sale that we have in Columbus. There's all kinds of fur that comes in, and every now and then there'll be like one guy or two guys will come in and they'll have a few gray fox, and you always ask them where it's from. It's always like those counties. It's like a little pocket. But even when I started trapping early 2000s, I could just even see the taper to now, just gradual and gradual. It's just kind of weird to see how it's all playing out. But
So can you give us what your findings are, or what you attribute this decline in population to, or is it too early to ask that, or?
I guess
It's
I
one
guess
of
I would say I don't know that there's necessarily a silver bullet or sort of one clear
smoking gun.
thing a smoking gun. Yes, that's a better metaphor.
Yeah.
That there really isn't one obvious thing. One thing that we're following up with for phase two is disease does seem to be an important component to it, at least here in Indiana for our foxes.
Hmm.
So canine distemper virus was something going into it. We suspected or we had heard that disease could be an issue, and so that was something that we cast a pretty broad net for. And so that's something that we're kind of circling back to and looking. Canine distemper virus was something that popped up with our gray foxes, and so now it's more of a question of, okay, well, it's been on the landscape for at least decades. It's not a new disease. So what could be going on? Like why would that be is it a greater source of mortality? Are there new strains that are circulating? Are they just being exposed to it more? Is there something about co-infections or, toxins in the environment that are just suppressing their immune system that's making them more susceptible to it? So I would say, it might be kind of a complex, multiple factors involved, but disease is one thing that we're circling back and kind of, trying to dig a little bit further into for phase two.
Yeah, I think we
And
had
and think
13 foxes that died, that we were able to confirm somehow they died. And I think like half of those were distemper was their cause of death. So that was kind of our number one cause of mortality.
and to so a specific example, at least over however many decades, would be, I mean, what if raccoon population's done? They just really they're everywhere,
Hmm.
right? And there's a lot of them. And so one question might be, well, are they serving as reservoirs for this and transmitting it? We actually have a gray fox and again, this is one anecdotal observation. We've got on video a gray fox at one of the den sites that's basically fighting off a couple of raccoons and defending the den site. So, there's some level of contact between them.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and the kind of strain information of distemper, because like there's quite a few diseases where there's different strains of it, right? You hear about that with like flu viruses, right? They have to get a new flu vaccine every year because there's different strains and mutations and things happening. But we haven't really been able to dig into the strains of distemper too much for gray foxes, but that's what we want to do moving forward now that we know this is a cause of mortality. And it's kind of like, okay, so what does that mean? Is there anything we can do about it? And kind of part of that is figuring out like what strains most likely are to impact gray foxes, right? Is it a raccoon strain? Is it a coyote strain? Is it a domestic dog strain? Like what strains are in Indiana and which ones seem to result in, more infection in our gray foxes?
Hmm. Any, um, I mean, typically when something gets distemper, that's it. I mean, they don't survive it, correct?
For the most part, I mean, for gray foxes at least, it seems to have high mortality. So some animals are able to have it and have sort of either subclinical, like maybe they get a little bit sick, but not obvious symptoms, or they're asymptomatic. They're fine with it.
Okay.
One of the things, oftentimes they may not die from distemper. It may be that it just suppresses it attacks the immune system is one of the things that it attacks. And so they oftentimes die from a secondary infection. So it may not necessarily be the distemper, although the distemper is kind of the ultimate reason why the animal dies. So I mean, at least in gray foxes, I don't know that we have any evidence of animals that were really sick from it and then recovered and were totally fine. But I know in other, it's variable from individual to individual and maybe what strain of distemper they have. But in other animals, they can certainly get it and they're fine, or they may
Yeah,
not die
raccoons.
from it. Yeah, raccoons in particular.
Yeah.
Some get sick and die, but some are fine and shed that virus in a bunch of places for other things to pick up.
Right. Any other ideas that you can attribute the decline to?
I mean, so some of the other things we're looking at, and I don't know if Tim and Jerry Ann, if you, I mean, I think once we kind of started digging into the literature, I'm like, okay, this is other people are seeing this too, and so maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised by it. But just sort of how the proximity to people, and sort of anthropogenic sources of food. So we looked at and used DNA to look at the diet. So for foxes that were dead, we'd open up their stomachs. Sometimes you could look in the stomach and you could see what they had been eating, but oftentimes it was just kind of a mush. And so you could use DNA evidence basically to figure out what are all the different species that are present in that stomach. And for a fair number of them, we identified things that would indicate signature of pet food, peanuts, things, some of them
Cows.
had yeah, some of them had barcode stickers from plants, like they were
Mm.
getting into people's garbage or compost bins, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So I think proximity to humans, and whether that's to kind of avoid coyotes or using it as a food source, whatever it may be, that may come with costs. It may come as increasing their exposure to diseases. It may come with weakening their immune system if they're eating human provisioned foods. I mean, it's not great for us to eat McDonald's or, eat various, kind of junk foods, and it may not be great for gray foxes to eat that kind of stuff either. So that's something we're kind of looking at more too, is there something that's happening kind of more broadly to their immune system, to their body that's kind of making them weaker, that's maybe making them more susceptible to disease, or it's kind of making them congregate or come into situations where they're more likely to pick up some sort of a disease from, a pet food bowl or, compost bins, things where other animals may be congregating.
Yeah,
Yeah,
raccoons
they,
also
they
love pet food, so
yeah, exactly. And they seem to be there's several indications that they're tied closely to humans in several respects, whether it's denning under buildings, staying close to buildings up at least up to a certain threshold, so that not, metropolitan areas necessarily, but near roads that might be serving as, edge cover, avoiding ag areas, or at least row crop areas, which is what we suspected and stuff like that. So utilizing some of these human sources of food, human structures for cover, as Don mentioned, perhaps to reduce predation risk,
Mhm.
associated with coyotes and coyotes will often avoid those areas and stuff. So they might be filling in those gaps simply because that's where they can survive.
Mhm. I
yeah, one of
know.
the things I hear trappers tell me were telling me a lot before we started the project is like, well, coyotes are killing them all. And we didn't have any that were directly killed by coyotes that we could pin down
Mhm.
and distinctly identify. But we do wonder if there's maybe some what we call partitioning happening, where gray foxes are going to places where they're better able to avoid coyotes.
Mhm.
And so it's like changing what they might prefer if coyotes hadn't been there, and making them use these kind of areas that might be riskier for a few reasons. So,
I know in this area, when in the 70s, first half of the 80s, uh, the habitat was definitely a much better for them too, in terms of just a wider spread population. Between row farming, which a lot of the farmers have taken out the habitat for wildlife, and then we have incredible urban sprawl because we're pretty close to Indianapolis. So I think those obviously go hand in hand with the decline in population or whatever. Now, and you mentioned the gray foxes being more up around humans. certainly the red foxes are definitely, which we have definitely have more of a population of reds, and that is definitely the case with them. They just literally sit in your backyard essentially if they're there. So
Yeah.
we've got one little pocket where I live, and it's where I live is fairly rural, but there's one, and we've been down there now for I think 14 years. And there's just been like a pocket of red foxes that we see every year. Just saw them twice last week, just driving down the road, which is kind of cool. I'm glad to see them, and I'm glad to see that they're at least have enough offspring to maintain somewhat of a population in that area. But here again, it seems to be up around people's homes, even though it is a rural area. But
yeah.
And that's been the case across a lot of the US, even where you can see red foxes in those situations. And it might be a response like Jerry Ann described too. It's, space partitioning where they're simply avoiding coyotes, for example, could be one reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because the counties, there's a bunch of interesting habitat stuff I feel like we learned and got a better handle on through this project. But for those of you who know Indiana, the southern counties where we find gray foxes are not highly populated, right? There's plenty of forest and forest pasture mixes where the foxes wouldn't need to be near people. And yet they're seeking out like these homes and garages and sheds and things like that. I think every single one of the dens we found was under some sort of human structure, something, right? It was either an abandoned shed or it was like a pile of old abandoned culverts or like a concrete pile. And it was like all of it. We found like 6 dens, so it wasn't a high number of dens. They were a little tricky to pin down on whether they were denning, but there was just like a lot of human use, even in these like areas that like include places like Hoosier National Forest.
It didn't have to be human. Yeah.
Is where they wouldn't necessarily have to be picking those areas. I think the dens were kind of interesting too because we kind of measured the habitat around the dens and then like a random other plot to compare them to, like what's available versus what they're choosing. And it seemed like cover was important, but higher than I would have thought it would be. It was like cover like 8 to 10 feet above the den is where they would be a little more likely to select when they were picking dens. So, and that might be like an avian predator on the pups protection.
Yeah.
Of just trying to prevent like owls and hawks from carrying them off. But they really seem like an edge species, right? If you have two habitat types meeting, that's kind of the places gray foxes are using, whether that's someone's yard in a forest or forest in a pasture and things like that. And when you think of Indiana and how much ag and stuff like we have, that seems like it would be a good thing that they want to use edge because we have a lot of edge in Indiana, but yet they're not as widespread as there used to be. So there has to be something like missing, but we don't know what that is. Our home ranges were pretty big. There's about 3 to 3.5 square miles. And some other studies on gray foxes, they're usually closer to 1 square mile, which kind of makes us wonder of like, are they having to go a lot farther to get what they need? And that's why they got to cover a lot more ground. Because like with coyotes, urban coyotes, they only need like a half a square mile because there's so much food. Like they just don't need as much space, but they get onto the rural areas and they're covering like 10 square miles to get what they need. And then we also had a student who did some modeling. He took all the observations of gray foxes we had collected over the years, trail camera photos, our Archer's Index reports, which is where volunteer hunters in the fall tell us about the wildlife they see while they're bow hunting and how many hours they're spending hunting. Um, Observations we had gotten submitted to our report forms and things like that. And he kind of modeled it out. And there was kind of 3 top things that seemed to predict gray foxes. One being forest cover, one being what they call refugia, which basically means hiding cover. And then there was like a foraging cover, which basically means where would we expect them to be looking for food. And where all 3 of those models agreed that we should have gray foxes is only like 3.5% of Indiana, which isn't great. And the most generous model, I think it was like 18% of Indiana. And basically there was kind of an interesting split where south of Indianapolis in the middle of the state, they're typically using forest cover. But if you go north of there where we have less forest cover, a lot of times it's more like suburban scrubland is where they're predicted to be. So they seem to really, the cover seems to be important. But we're kind of wondering, like, after learning all this interesting stuff about their habitat, like, is there something about the quality of the edge habitat that matters that we just weren't able to quite pin down?
Mhm.
Like, if it's edge habitat that's all like bush honeysuckle that's full of ticks that spread tick-borne illnesses, like, that's not great for them. They need kind of higher quality edge, and maybe there's some things there in that kind of edge habitat that's either risky to them or they're not selecting because it's not a good enough edge for them to use.
So there needs to be more possums there to eat the ticks.
Yeah, totally. We need to just triple our possum population. No, we just need to remove all of our bush honeysuckle.
Don't start that.
That's false.
Yeah,
We're not going to edit that out, but
possums don't actually help with ticks. No.
don't take that line and run with it. So
Someone's gonna sample out just you saying that and be like, look, proof.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It just, do we know? Well, I'm sure how many, for a litter, how many are they usually having as far as gray fox?
So that was one thing we did do for female carcasses is we took out the reproductive tracts. I mean, one thing, a lot of our foxes were young. I'd say most of them were sort of young of the year, kind of 0-year-olds. One, two, I think maybe we had one 3-year-old, one 4-year-old. So, I mean, they don't have a really, really old age structure. Um, we kind of limited our reproductive tract analysis to, even though it's probably unlikely that they're going to get pregnant their first winter, we went ahead and looked. So ones that were, maybe 11-month old and older, we took out their reproductive tracts and looked. And so you can look at them, depending on the time of year. They might be pregnant. You might actually see, kind of swellings, little embryos in the in the reproductive tracts in the uterus. But once they've given birth, the places where they um, have attached to the uterus will leave a scar once they give birth. So we call those placental scars. And so you can look at those placental scars and count them to see how many they gave birth to. You could also look at the ovaries. And so when the eggs get released, there's sort of a morphological change that happens. We call these corpor so these kind of little circular bits in the ovary. And we actually send those to a company, Matson's in Montana, and they do the ovary analysis. So anyway, they should kind of match up. But we can look at those two pieces of information. And anywhere from 2 to 6, I would say, was kind of our litter size. Ones that we saw, we actually had some that we had on trail cam, 3, 4. So like 3.3, I think was maybe our average. If you look at ones that were actually pregnant, Jerry, and maybe you have those numbers handy, but does that sound about right? Like
It was like
3.3?
3.6. Yeah. It
3.6,
was like
something
right
like
in
that.
there though. Yeah. 3 to 4 seems to be the average. And yeah, a couple of our fox, I think one of our foxes that was collared had like 5, but basically 4. The answer is 4.
Okay.
That's the average.
So
So
what do you attribute the age to? Do you think that the mortality rate was just so high and that's the reason you weren't catching older ones? Or I realize this went over 3 seasons, so you couldn't say it was coincidental necessarily, or that just the older ones were smart enough and they weren't getting caught, which doesn't seem likely. Or is it just the way this shook out?
Well, of our radio colored foxes, we had a 68% annual survival rate,
Okay.
and which is very reasonable based off the literature. So I don't have a good, maybe Don or Jerry Ann will weigh in on this, but why the age structure is so young, not sure. We also don't know. We'd also intended to look at pup survival, but that wasn't. We knew that would be logistically very difficult, so we were going to attempt it, but we ended up not really diving into that. But that would have been a good piece of information as well.
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know that we can, obviously say for sure. I mean, what's the quote? Like, science is about having facts, it's about asking questions and trying to learn more.
Mhm.
But I kind of do wonder if there is some like our survival rates were pretty good, but that was averaged over the 3 years. Like I felt like the first year we could not keep a fox alive that we had collared. But toward the end, our last year, it seemed like quite a few of them survived. But is there just some sort of pressure where they're just not living as long, but their year-to-year survival's like okay, it's in the range where we would want it to be, but that doesn't mean they're getting old.
Mhm.
Right? Because even with like we've had some river otters because we age all of our river otters here in Indiana for our population model. Like some of them lived to like 12 or 13, and like they had a coyote in Chicago that lived to be 20. So some other mid-sized carnivores do live a little longer, but I don't know what the like normal age range of like red foxes is. Is it in the same ballpark of that? Um, Tim, when you were doing the Cascade Red Fox stuff, were you guys aging any of those animals?
Yeah, Sierra Nevada red fox
Sierra
actually.
Nevada.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yep. And they were aging older than that.
Older.
And survival was approximately that as well. I think it was a little higher. I think it was about 70 or low 70s. So, but they definitely had a little bit older age structure.
Yeah,
Yeah, it seems
interesting.
almost a little what's that word? It doesn't seem like it matches up, right?
Out of
Because
whack.
you would think it seems a little like with our survival rate being kind of what we might expect, like why aren't a few of them getting older? But
Yeah,
yeah,
And
we had a
maybe it was
pretty young
luck
age
of the
structure.
draw.
yeah, just the
Typical
Yeah.
way. Yeah,
coincidence. Yeah, the reason I asked, I was just sitting here thinking like, you know, we'll have seasons here where numbers on this animal or that animal or even deer is like, man, we got smoked in this area due to chronic wasting disease or whatever, but
or EHD.
or EHD and
EHD,
stuff
yeah.
just keeps they rebound eventually, and I just feel like the grays never rebounded, so it's like, what's that extra thing that's keeping it down, it's just
Yeah, and it's kind of feeling to me, seeing this data that we're collecting, that there's like a disease component to that. And there might also be a habitat component to that of like what's not letting them expand as much as maybe we would like them to back into some of these places. So, but there wasn't like a sign that we're going to lose them, right? It wasn't all like a doom and gloom, like our gray foxes are going to be extinct in Indiana, extirpated in Indiana in 2 years. Like it wasn't anything like that, right? They're having pups. Some of them are surviving, but there's definitely some pieces here that make us suspicious about the reasons why they aren't more widespread.
yeah.
Going back to well, couple things. The partitioning that you were talking about when and I realized we were in Arkansas. We've trapped there a number of years, and we would. I mean, you would catch gray foxes and coyotes in the same area, but it was pretty unusual. But normally, if we got in an area and we caught several gray foxes, we didn't really catch coyotes. And it was pretty noticeable.
Yeah.
That there would be pockets of them.
Yeah.
That one on trip particularly. But it was, it makes you wonder, and you guys had mentioned it, or one of you, I think Jerry Ann mentioned it earlier that, since the mid 80s, essentially, our coyote population's quite good. We've had all these bobcats show up. We've had, got a good population of bald eagles. We've definitely got stuff that's come in that wasn't around in the 70s and 80s to speak of. How do you guys feel that plays a role in this? Or do you have a handle on that?
So I think there's a couple things there where again, I don't think any of those animals are directly killing gray foxes, but there's some spots that gray foxes used to use that maybe they're not using as much anymore because of things like coyotes and stuff like that. There's been at least two, if not more, projects that kind of use cameras and found that areas with high coyote usage, gray foxes avoid it. Interestingly, they did not find that for bobcats, especially this project that just wrapped up into Illinois. Bobcats and gray foxes didn't seem to care about each other. So
Mhm.
gray foxes didn't seem to avoid bobcats actively from that project, but they do seem to avoid coyotes. So it kind of goes back to that maybe there are some habitats where they would be using them if coyotes weren't using that area really intensely, and that is putting some limiting factor. There's been some other changes like you were mentioning, Charlie, where we've lost some of our fence rows along our fields and things like that that probably used to be great gray fox habitat and great gray fox travel corridors. But yeah, it could just be that the options are a little more limited now just because of the use of coyotes in some of these areas.
I mean, that was kind of everybody's guess is it kind of did correlate when the coyotes showed up, our gray fox numbers declined, as our red foxes did too. They just weren't hurt as bad as the grays. But that was just complete speculation on most people's parts. And I don't, obviously what you're saying is that's not, may play a factor in it, but it's not really what's going on. So, but I think may have been you, Jerry, and that mentioned that maybe the 70s and 80s with that population that we had, that was just out of the norm anyways. That like
Yeah.
past history prior, to that time frame or I don't know how long for records, I can't remember what you've said, but in the early 1900s, they may have not been around very much then either. I don't know. So
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's like our records get sketchier the farther back you go, right? Of how much do we know? What were things like back then? Like historically, like when the first Europeans were starting to come into the area, like the reality was we probably had wolves and gray foxes in forest, which was about 2/3 of the state or 3/4 of the state was forested. And then we would have had coyotes in the prairie section of the state, which was kind of more the northwestern third or so of Indiana, right? So that was probably how it was originally, but we don't know what gray fox densities would have been back then and kind of how they would have interacted with wolves differently than they interact now with coyotes. But our fur buyer records go back to the 50s, and the 50s records are quite low for our gray fox that were being purchased by fur buyers. And then there's this big jump into the 70s, this big arc upwards, and then it comes right back down. So yeah, like 70s, a lot of people reference that time of like gray foxes were everywhere, back in this day. And they were, I think they were, right? But I don't also know that that was normal.
yeah.
But I also don't know that where we are now is where we want them to be. Like, do we probably want them to be a little more distributed than they are, just to make sure that we maintain good, genetic health and population health and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know that the 70s are necessarily the right reference point of what we're trying to get back to someday.
Yeah, they were everywhere. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
the very first year I trapped, I was like 15 and I caught 3 foxes and they were all gray foxes. It was just like, and now, you couldn't do that if you trapped the whole season in numerous counties, so.
And not this was around here.
Not in your county.
Yeah.
You're in central Indiana. Yeah. And you could still, if you went down to like Harrison County,
Right,
you could still get
right.
a couple gray foxes down there.
Right.
Well,
But
in
yeah.
that period that Jerry Ann's describing, like I was reading that in around 1950, gray foxes were exceedingly rare in Kansas, and then they started moving in and following these riparian areas, stream corridors for cover and expanding, moving into Manitoba, Ontario, and so those were certainly decades where at the North American level they seem to be expanding overall in distribution and probably abundance too. So.
And the genetic data across the United States, and particularly focusing in on the eastern U.S., kind of bears that out. There's sort of a flux about 200 years ago of a bit of an expansion of the eastern population of gray foxes. So we start to see more kind of around Texas, Oklahoma. There's a split between gray foxes that spent, kind of evolved and spent most of their time in the eastern U.S. and then ones that were from the western U.S. And there was a pulse about 200 years ago, so kind of coinciding with European colonization, that you see, gray foxes expanding from east to west. So I think there is a little bit of truth. People, in Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, places like that are, how common were they? And is this kind of more of they expanded relatively recently? And I think that, the genetics show that there is probably a bit of truth to that they have expanded from east to west.
Don, correct me if I'm wrong. I think when we did the podcast 4 years ago, you had mentioned that the gray foxes, though, that like in New Mexico, that don't, I mean, they look like a gray fox, but their tails are long. I mean, they're different looking, but they didn't have the same genetic background. They weren't like connected with an eastern gray fox. Is that
Right, right. Yeah. So they've been diverged. So they haven't shared gene flow. They've been separate populations for about 1 million years. So 800,000 to 1 million years, kind of depending on what data set you use. Um, um, and, we've kind of looked at it multiple different ways, but yeah, they're pretty divergent from one another. The thought is during the Pleistocene when we had glaciers, kind of coming and going, the central part of the U.S. was not, very tree covered. It wasn't really great habitat for gray foxes, so it was kind of a barrier to
Mhm.
dispersal and to other species too. I see an east-west split when I, look at bobcats. I mean, when you look at other species, you see, this kind of east-west divide along the Great Plains. But what was interesting was just how long term, kind of how dramatic that split was for gray foxes. 1 million years without, sharing gene flow and kind of being separate, even though there were periods of time when those glaciers retreated that, there could have been opportunity for expansion. They didn't really.
Yeah.
And so this is yeah, to the level that, there's other fox species, they're different species. And they have that level of divergence. So the foxes in the east and the west, I mean, we do, so there have been some follow-up studies looking in places like Texas and Oklahoma where those two lineages meet,
Mhm.
and seeing some gene flow, but it's pretty restricted gene
Yeah.
flow between those lineages.
That's really interesting. I mean, when you start talking about 1 million years, it's hard to wrap your mind around it. But
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, but that's very interesting. So,
Almost want to rename them something different.
yeah, they look different. So,
Certain people are lumpers and some are splitters when it comes to taxonomy. So it could be if a splitter gets a hold of it, then the western foxes might become their own fox.
Yep.
Yeah.
well, we
So,
have long-tailed weasels, so we could have long-tailed gray foxes and
yeah, and short-tailed gray foxes.
Yeah.
That'd be fun.
I'll just call them East and West for now.
Yeah.
That's what
But
I call east and west. Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
very creative.
Yeah. I think so.
so some of the other genetic stuff we kind of dug into a little bit too here in Indiana, as well as kind of looking at the bigger picture, because Dawn's a geneticist,
Right.
by specialty, right? So, because one of the questions we have was about like inbreeding. Are our gray foxes inbred? Do we have, gene flow kind of north to south? Are we worried about, there's this term in conservation called your effective population size, which Donna's probably going to be better able to explain because I'm sure she has to teach this to students what effective population size means. But it's basically like kind of your minimum amount of genetic diversity, and you want that to be like over a certain number. And we dug into some of that too with our gray foxes. And on a good sign was that our effective population size was good. It was what we kind of expect, and we didn't have inbreeding issues. And we actually did see some connectivity north to south, even though there's kind of a big corn desert in between our north and south in Indiana, like some other states like Illinois and Iowa, right? We have these big row crop ag areas, but we were still seeing those connections. And there's also from the regional stuff, Don could probably dig into this more, but there were some interesting trends where some of our northern foxes also had some shared lineage with southern Illinois gray foxes. So we kind of wonder if they're maybe like hitting the Wabash River and kind of walking up north and kind of connecting all these populations with some of these features, like some of our rivers. So
So do you think they're literally, sorry, Donna, do you think they're literally crossing the river or are they getting on a bridge or?
So, I mean, compared to bobcats, I'd say rivers seem like more of a barrier to gray foxes. So certainly none of our foxes, um, seem to cross the river, whether swimming or by bridge. So Tim, Jerry, and I were sort of chatting about this because on a regional scale, you see kind of a fine scale genetic structure split along the Mississippi River. So foxes east versus west of the Mississippi River kind of have different genetic patterns, kind of indicating that's a barrier. And that was certainly not anything that I saw with bobcats. They're much more willing to swim across the river. So I don't think that we have much evidence that I mean, in fact, I don't think they particularly like water are going to readily swim across or go across bridges. I mean, it's always a potential, but it doesn't really seem like that's kind of their favorite way of moving across these
Mhm.
open habitats. But using riparian corridors, and it may not be like one fox, but it's just sort of a hopscotch. This fox goes a little bit further, and it doesn't really take that much gene flow between populations to intermix them, and kind of make them show. I mean, when you're talking about genetics, you're oftentimes talking about pretty long time spans, and it doesn't take that long to kind of intermix the gene flow. It doesn't take that many migrants. So, at least the foxes there in Indiana are pretty closely genetically related to most of the foxes in the eastern US, kind of east of the
Right.
Mississippi River.
We also didn't have any foxes in southern Indiana cross over into Kentucky across the river there. So
Yeah, they go across the
the
Ohio.
yeah, our fixed intervals were 7 hours, I believe. So they'd have to zip over there and back if we missed it. It's not impossible, but no location showed up in Kentucky based on our data.
Yeah, they
Interesting.
might have made a quick run for bourbon, but we couldn't prove it. So it seemed like mostly. And I suspect with the Illinois foxes, they're hitting the Wabash and following it north, not necessarily crossing it. But at
Mhm.
some point the Wabash gets small again. So
I mean, and it actually does um, cold weather. It can get a solid freeze on it.
Water.
So
Yeah.
I don't know that the Ohio River ever does, but I've seen the Wabash where you could say that it was probably solid all the way across. So which is unusual, but
Yeah, with some of the what we call resource selection, so what types of like habitats are they picking for or picking against? Like what are they choosing versus what do they seem to be avoiding? It was kind of interesting that I think the three big things that they were avoiding was like really high intensity human development. So like downtown Indianapolis, and
right.
downtown Chicago. Um, row crop ag, and then water, weirdly, was one of them. So they don't seem to have a strong affiliation for wanting to be around water necessarily, but those are, again, like Dom was saying, really good travel corridors. So when they're trying to move.
Water as in rivers, big rivers, or an area like Goose Pond, or just water in
So
general.
Goose Pond probably in the type of data we were using, and Tim can correct me or back me up on this, but I think in the land cover data set we were using, something like Goose Pond would be listed as like a wetland.
Yeah.
So it would be more like open water, like lakes and ponds, and I think rivers would have been in that too, right?
Which they avoided wetlands too. So
So they just don't like their feet wet at all.
Okay.
And there is interestingly a paper, Tim said somewhere in the South that said culverts can help them get under like big busy roads, but they had to be dry. Like they
Yep.
don't want to use a damp culvert.
Right.
small, dry, and with thick cover
Okay.
around it.
Makes sense.
That's wild.
So I guess, some would think you've got the data, but there's not, in the scheme of things, there's not really anything you can do to change the course of this, right?
So there could be like obviously with some of the habitat stuff and things like we know they use roads, but they need to be able to safely cross roads, right? There's um some interest more and more in what we call wildlife crossings, right? Which is
Yeah.
like safe places and animals can get across roads. Things like corridors. Like if you're a farmer and you have an ag field, like having just a shrubby edge on it, it doesn't even need to be very wide, but having some sort of shrubby edge helps foxes be able to move through there. So there are some habitat things to do. I think we need to learn more on the disease side before we say if there's anything we can do there or not.
Mhm.
Is anyone ever gonna, if it is December, is anyone ever gonna put money toward making a gray fox December vaccine? I don't know that we will, because it's not like a disease that,
Right.
gets into humans and things like that. But I definitely think there's some habitat things here.
I think also toxin exposure and just sort of being mindful of things that we leave outside. So, we had at least one of our foxes die of antifreeze poisoning. We had one that potentially showed some exposure to rodenticides, or at least kind of had some symptoms. Didn't end up testing positive for it, but it just seemed like that was all of the earmarks of it was rodenticide
Which
poisoning.
is
So, like an anticoagulant that people leave out
For
to
mice.
kill
Or
mice
rats.
and yep, mice
Yeah,
and stuff
rat
like that.
poison.
And so they might actually come and eat it directly, or it may be that they're eating the things that are eating the anticoagulant.
Okay. I I think that was an issue. Listened to a podcast. An issue with mountain lions in the Cali.
Fisher, I know out in California, it was a
Fisher in
big issue for
California.
Fisher.
Okay.
They would
Okay.
put rodenticides around the like hemp marijuana fields, and then the fisher would eat the rodents, and then they die.
Okay. I think this one was specifically about the mountain lion, the one or two mountain lions that live around the Hollywood sign,
Oh yeah,
and they had
yeah,
mentioned um, they had mentioned that in relation to those, I believe. So, but
it could be. So we've been starting to screen a few animals for rodenticides, like a few bobcats we get that are like roadkill or turned in incidental and things like that. And it's been fairly low. I think we had like 3 out of our 47 bobcats test positive for rodenticides, so not too high. But I think we're interested in looking at things like rodenticides more in our gray foxes in this next phase that we're going to be getting started. So,
there will be another phase here in Indiana.
yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so the next phase, we're continuing with the disease sampling, but expanding it. So looking at toxins, right? So looking at rodenticides, looking at pesticides, neonicotinoid pesticides. I mean, basically just things that might be suppressing their immune systems that
Okay.
might make them more susceptible to various pathogens. We're also testing, so looking a little bit more carefully at some of those tick-borne diseases. So Jerry Ann kind of mentioned, like, yeah, without possums around. No, she's just joking. But having a lot of ticks and ticks being able to spread diseases. Is there something about that might also make them more susceptible to other infections? So those are, yeah, some of the areas that we're continuing to expand. And then the aspect of the diet, right? So, is it that they're, yeah, just coming into closer contact with people, congregating with raccoons and other things that they're fighting over pet food or, uh, compost bins or
Right.
garbage cans for food that might make them more susceptible to picking up infections. And then also looking at testing. So phase one was strictly gray foxes. Phase two, we also want to know, okay, where might they be getting distemper? So I mean, we know lots of different species can carry it, but if we start sequencing the different strains, maybe we can get insight into, okay, is it primarily raccoons, or is it, no, it's everything, or what may be carrying it. So we're also going to be testing other species as well.
Okay. So
Yeah,
when does that start?
it started in January.
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Yep, so we're starting right now. We'll have a technician come on board here next month, and we'll start collecting samples in May.
Is this a 3-year study as
3-year
well?
field, yep, 3-year field and 1 year of kind of data analysis and write-up.
Okay.
Yeah, the health stuff just gets so complex, right? It's no different than in humans, right? Like
Right.
if you have leukemia, you're more likely to get pneumonia, right? And things like that. And we see some of the same things in wildlife, like babesia was a really common co-infection that we had, which was a tick-borne illness. And toxoplasmosis was another common, which, is the one where they tell like why they tell pregnant women not to clean cat litter boxes is because they spread toxoplasmosis, right? That's that disease. Um, so, but there's all these different pieces of it. It's like, what is actually the like direct cause of death? Like they were dying of distemper, maybe, but what were all the things that like just drug them down to get to the point that they died of distemper? And that can be such a complex interaction of things that we're just trying to,
Yeah.
get more information there. Because we were even having a discussion. Ohio's looking at some rodenticide anticoagulant stuff, and when we were talking to them about it, it kind of made me curious with the diet stuff. Is like, do we see the foxes who eat more mice, the ones who are getting the rodenticide exposure? Like a lot of our foxes were eating plants. Like 9 out of 10 stomachs we had plants in them. They're very omnivorous. But mice and voles were like the number one mammal. It was like 6 out of every 10 stomachs or something like that would have a mammal in it of some kind, and mice and voles were the most common. They also arthropods were fairly common too. About 2 of every 10 stomachs would have arthropods in them, which are like insects, and moths were actually the most common. So they're running down moths somehow and chewing up those guys. So they got this really diverse diet, but like, what's the connection of like if you get one that's more of a fruit specialist and they're maybe not getting the same rodenticide exposure as one of the foxes that's, really focused in on eating a lot of, the mice that get around people's homes that they're trying to get rid of.
Right. Yeah, and obviously since they're living in urban areas or a lot of them, then it all just goes hand in hand. So yeah.
Yep.
Maybe they're hanging around porch lights to get those moths or something, huh?
Ooh,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah.
It's
Can you just imagine coming out into your porch and on the porch railing is a gray fox trying to jump at moths?
That would be
That'd
pretty
be
cool,
fun.
actually.
That'd be really fun.
That's like our house cat that if a moth gets in the house, he just goes crazy. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
Tries to
gray
eat it.
foxes are they're pretty
Yeah.
cat-like in many
Yeah.
ways.
So when trapping season rolls around, are you going to be putting notices out there or things online about collaring again, or what you have is what you have to work with?
We'll be putting notice. So at this point, we're more interested in carcasses than live captured animals. So for phase 2, the live capture part is wrapped up, and so it's primarily the carcasses for disease and toxin testing.
okay.
And so we'll be putting notices out for those. We're primarily interested, certainly in gray foxes, but then also, we'll be kind of strategically. We don't need, every raccoon that people catch. We kind of want to be strategic because
We can't afford every raccoon that people would catch.
Oh my
Right.
gosh, they're
No,
everywhere.
that would be like
But
semi-loads.
yeah,
and we're trying to target, so we had a few samples, but not very many from northern Indiana. And so, is that just because they're not very common there, or is it just because, we had more of a presence in southern Indiana? And so, again, kind of targeting those counties that Jerry Ann mentioned, because this is all, meant to kind of link to gray foxes, and we know that that's where the gray fox population is the strongest. And so we definitely want to know what's going on in that particular area.
Yeah.
But then also, yeah, there's how common is this, and the factors that we're seeing in southern Indiana? Is it the same thing that's going on in other states? Is it the same thing that's going on in northern Indiana? We sort of want to know, or is it, kind of different, multiple little things, but in some areas, something's more important of a factor in the decline than others. So yeah, we're trying to also get some more carcasses from up in northern Indiana.
yeah,
Let's-
and I think we'll be especially interested if a trapper catches an animal they feel is sick, right? Because that's our best bet to get some of this like distemper strains and things like that. Like the chance of stumbling across distemper in an animal that seems perfectly healthy is, low, not impossible, but low. So I think especially if trappers are in Indiana are catching things this fall and they're like, this raccoon didn't look quite right, or, this coyote was kind of not holding its head right and things like that. We will be especially interested in those animals that appear to have some sort of illness.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll keep an eye out here.
Yeah. It's kind of a dilemma for a trapper when they catch a gray fox because a lot of them just,
Yeah,
they want to turn them loose or they don't feel right killing it. So it's good, but this obviously is for good
Right.
research. So yeah.
And I don't know that we want anyone like killing a fox they wouldn't have chosen to otherwise for
Okay.
just our research project. But
Okay.
if people are choosing to harvest their gray fox especially, but we also will probably be looking for some red foxes as well, then we definitely would want to take advantage of them. So
Surely. Yeah. Definitely
Yeah.
get some. And a skinned carcass would be okay too, correct?
absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, we
So
don't
that-
actually use the fur for any of our disease testing, I don't believe, Dawn, are we?
Nope.
So
Okay. Okay. Before we wrap this up, are there any other, I'm sure this is an open question, but are there other animals of specific concern
Muskrats.
in that you guys are looking at? I know this is a big, I mean,
So we don't have any other research going on specifically about a species of concern. Obviously, some of the other research projects that I have going on are we're still working on the economics work. I think I've mentioned before when I've been on here, because we've been doing that for a couple years now and try to understand how people of Indiana value different fur bearers and in different ways for harvest for viewing, or for feeding around homes or the damage they're causing around homes and things like that. We're doing some diet stuff around coyotes and bobcats from some samples we had collected as part of a different research project. I am getting a small muskrat project going, but it's not necessarily as focused on like the muskrat populations. It's that from some survey work we had done for secretive marsh birds. So these are birds that like to hang around wetland areas that you very rarely see. Things like rails, the king rail, the Virginia rail, soras, stuff like that. They found that muskrats actually benefit some of those secretive marsh bird species. So now there's a researcher out of the University of Chicago who's interested in seeing if you're trying to restore a wetland, and they seem to really love muskrat houses, muskrat huts, some of these marsh birds and the openings they create. So like if you go in and like fake a muskrat hut, does it help bring some of these birds back more quickly in a wetland restoration? And they're comparing them to ones that muskrats are building naturally on their own. So they're trying to mimic a muskrat den, and they're letting muskrat houses, measuring around muskrat houses as well to see kind of like if you're trying to restore a wetland, like how can you bring some of these species back and get diversity back most effectively? So it's like muskrats are part of it, but we're not looking at like the health of muskrats or anything specific like that. It's kind of more about the community, the wetland communities that they provide a lot of benefits to. But yeah, muskrats are a big one on my radar. Otters and bobcats, we need to do some work to update our population models probably here in the next several years, depending on how funding stuff goes. But those are the main species in Indiana that we've been most concerned about were gray foxes. And then muskrats seem to be like stable now, but again, they're not where they used to be. So we'd like to dig into them a little bit. We are sending off a few muskrat samples to a multi-state research project that's doing some base health sampling on muskrats. So that should give us a little bit of insight of, across the whole, there's a bunch of states participating. It's like 20 or something like that.
Okay.
Kind of across the eastern United States, do we see any kind of trends in certain health aspects of muskrats? Like Tizer's disease is one that can affect muskrats. And again, going back to some of the contaminants, like heavy metals and things like that they can pick up in water, they're going to just get some baseline information that states can build off of. So that's a small muskrat thing. We're not doing it, but we're contributing a few samples too for muskrats. But they're definitely one we're interested in the future. And for us, badgers, we're kind of on the edge of badger range, and we don't know a bunch about badgers. So someday we probably kind of need to figure out a little better where they are in Indiana. And then weasels are probably the other one where we just don't know a lot about them. There's actually a student who's using this relatively newish technique. It's called an drift fence. So drift fence for researchers have been used a lot in like the herp community, which is amphibians, reptiles, snakes, things like that, right? So you set up this big long fence and you put buckets at the end, and the animals hit the fence, walk down it, and then they fall into the buckets. That's the old way that you do a drift fence, right? So you could get salamanders and snakes and things like that. So they've taken that, and instead of having the buckets the animals fall into, they've turned the buckets upside down and they put a camera in the top of the bucket. So the animal hits the fence, they follow it, they go into the bucket, they get their picture taken, and then they can leave. So you don't have animals sitting in a trap anymore. And we're hoping they've gotten some weasels and stuff on that. They surveyed statewide, kind of looking, our mammologist set that project up because he's looking for small mammals like shrews and moles and things like that we just don't get a lot of information for. I'm kind of hoping they have enough weasel detections we could do something with it. But that's kind of, I'm hoping to glob on to something that someone else is doing after they're done. So, but they've been kind of sampled the whole state this last summer, and I know they got a couple weasels, but I don't know they're through all of their, because they had like 1 million photos from this summer, so I think they're still going through them.
Yeah.
But
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
so yeah, lots of fun stuff happening, but not anything like we don't have a big muskrat project starting like we have this big gray fox project going on, right? So yeah, hopefully someday.
Yeah. The muskrats, I mean, obviously not, we haven't lost the population of muskrats like we did gray foxes. They're, we still got certain areas in the state that have quite a few. So
yeah, they seem to be holding on better. So that's why we prioritized gray foxes. We were a little more worried about them.
Right.
Well,
we've got a big muskrat project in Ohio and Michigan. I won't go into too much detail there, but we're in our 5th or 6th year on that, and we're looking at toxicology and health and reproduction and wetland quality and lots of different things for that. So there's and it's a very large project with Michigan DNR, tribes, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, refuges, stuff like that. So and again, that's another one where I think I'm buying close to 2,000 muskrat carcasses from trappers from the UP of Michigan down to Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge in northern Ohio. So there's going to be a lot of good data from that.
Okay. Yet
That'd be
there's
cool.
still a good population of muskrats in Michigan generally, correct? Or not like
Well, I finished my PhD there in 2007, and I'd been hearing for quite some time before that trappers complaining about muskrats blinking out,
okay.
locally at least. So it's been 30 years or more that
Okay.
there's been some observations by trappers.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a researcher at K-State, I think Adam Allers, and he did some interesting work kind of looking at the fur buyer data with muskrat specifically and kind of correcting for pelt price being kind of used as a stand-in for like effort, how hard are people
Right.
trying to trap them, because your harvest depends a lot on how much effort trappers are expending. But he kind of corrected for pelt price, and I think almost every Midwestern state had seen declines in muskrats from the 70s except for the prairie potholes, like
Okay.
North Dakota, South Dakota, and part of
Right.
Minnesota. But I think every other state, we were in the like 50 to 60% decline since the 70s for muskrats in Indiana. And Michigan was not that, but I think they were still a decline.
Oh, I
So,
would, yeah. I mean, that's easily believable here, so.
yeah, I think some of the hardest hit states were like Georgia, some of those southeast states.
Okay.
Hmm.
You guys have any last word that you want to?
I just want to reiterate the appreciation for the role that trappers have played in this and other projects I've been involved with. It's just been absolutely key to success. So that's one thing and for Takers of America, various state trapping organizations. So it's really been, and trapping's why I do what I do. I'm a trapper that does research, which is a pretty good match, I think. So,
Right. Right.
That's cool.
Yep.
We'll have to get together and follow up on this here after a few years and see what.
Maybe we can talk. Well, maybe Tim will get together and talk about some of the other projects that you have going. Obviously, the majority of our listeners are out of Indiana, out of the state of Indiana. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is all relative to anyone really, because all states have active DNRs with biologists and doing studies. So, but
Yeah, I think that's what I was going to say. It's like, to reiterate a little bit what Tim said is, you know, licensed hunters and trappers were a really big part of our project. But if you're listening to us talking about this Indiana project and be like, man, I wish I could have done something like that, it is very possible your state is doing something like this and they are looking for help with it. So just seek out your fur bearer biologist or your, local wildlife health team or something like that. Figure out what they got going on and what they're interested in, because there's, a lot of states are looking for different things. I know Iowa's interested in getting gray fox observations and gray fox samples, and Ohio's in the midst of a gray fox project and wants samples, and you know Tim's got his muskrats going on in Michigan. Like, there's a bunch of projects going on throughout the country with different species. I think New York was looking for fisher at one point, and West Virginia was looking for river otters for a couple of years. So just keep your ears open. Like, there's things like this happening in every state that you can be part of, and we can learn a lot from.
right. Dawn, you have anything?
I think I'd just reiterate something that, Jerry Ann had said before too, is that there's, it's not all negative things. Sometimes it's easy to dwell on the challenges that we're seeing. But, there are some positives. I mean, we saw gray foxes reproducing. There's yeah, signs of hope, and they're not going to go extinct in the eastern United States. I mean, they're sort of genetically connected to other populations. So hopefully there's enough connections there that once we kind of figure out what are some of the things challenging them, they can make a rebound.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
I think on our
But
side, we more than appreciate you guys being out there,
Oh yeah.
doing this stuff. And obviously none of it's free and you get funding and, but appreciate your passion for what, this kind of work.
Thank you.
We'll have to get you
Thank you.
back on here, Jerry Ann, too. We're definitely gonna talk about bobcats now that we finally have a season in Indiana. Like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, the governor hasn't signed it as of this recording, but everything is progressing as we hope, and this fall should be our
I hope I didn't just
first bobcat season. Yeah, knock on
Yeah.
wood.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I don't know how long you take to put these out, but hopefully by, May of 25, everything will be signed and in the state register and all that stuff like it's supposed to be. And
Okay. Well, we won't do that episode until it's 100%.
Official. Yeah.
yeah.
But it looks good at this point. So cool.
We
right.
appreciate you guys.
We'll talk to you later, and
On X out.
we'll send this out to you once it's available.
Thanks for
Thanks
having
for
us
having
on.
us.
Great, thank you.